All right. Can you see it, Mauritius?
Yeah, I can. And I don't have control over that, right? So,
No, no.
okay. Yeah. I'll say next slide and so on. So that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Okay, so I'll get started. Let's see. Yeah, we're good. All right. So, yeah, the checklist habit, making it easier to do the right thing is the presentation and basically talking about, frequently we'll get into it as we go, but frequently, folks view checklists as an encumbrance and so on. But when used frequently, what it can do is allow us to do the right thing, which is do all our checks and make it easier for us to do it instead of relying on memory aids and so on. So, oh, next slide. Sorry. I'm trying to press this button, but it's not doing anything. So, quick little overview. There are a bunch of slides that are going to cover my background, and then we'll define checklists, talk a little bit about human factors, and then get right into checklist use in diving. So next slide. So for me, a lot of my background starts with, I would say, aviation even before aquatics, because I was in ACE, Aviation Career Enrichment, going back to a kid. It's a motivational program in Atlanta, originally started by Julius Alexander, and the goal was to get kids, primarily Black kids, involved in aviation. So I spent all my formative years in ACE and ultimately became a flight instructor and spent a lot of time in Civil Air Patrol doing search and rescue and flying as a mission pilot as well. I'm not actively teaching, but I am still actively flying. I'm getting back to teaching. Next slide. Oop, I think we jumped one. Yeah. As Cortland said, I spent a lot of time in aquatics. I was an aquatic director in Atlanta with the Atlanta Metropolitan YMCA, water safety instructor trainer, lifeguard instructor trainer for both the Red Cross and the YMCA, pool operator and swim team coach. Next slide. I'm also a freediving instructor. This is something that most people don't know about me, so I kind of threw some random stuff in there. And that picture on the left, I'm a performance freediving instructor. I'm not active as a freediving instructor, but just had this discussion with Kurt Crack, pictured there, the founder of Performance Freediving. This picture is interesting though, because the guy with his hands up doing this is Brad. He's literally number 3 in GoPro. So back then, Brad was not well known, but he's a exceptionally wealthy dude right now. And the guy next to him is Shane Healy, who's a famous, world famous big wave surfer. So it's probably one of the most interesting classes I've working with these folks. Next slide. I do have a background in commercial diving. I will preface that with it is a commercial diving in the aquarium setting, but working at Georgia Aquarium and also just recently at California Academy of Sciences. I do have a pretty extensive background doing heavy lifting projects, everything from full face masks to hard hats, using comms and video and lights and so on. That's the blind flange project that we had at the Georgia Aquarium left side. That flange that I'm lifting there is about 750 pounds. And the large flange that we put to cap off the large pipe for Ocean Voyager was about 2,000 pounds when everything was put together. So that's kind of the work that the diving operations team did, that we did at Georgia Aquarium, in addition to managing everything else. On the right side is a confined space entry going up in the scissor lift to drop down into our ozone contact towers to remove substrate. So that was a very fun time for my 4 years there. Not anything I've really had the opportunity to do since to that degree. Next slide. I've done one saturation mission in Aquarius. That's a 10-day saturation in the Aquarius habitat. I throw this picture in here just so people realize how small the habitat is. So picture on the left is us before decompressing. The 6 of us, that's 6 of us living in there for 10 days. The picture on the right is me standing directly on the entry to the picture on the left, looking through the rest of the habitat. So collectively, that's all the space you can see in there with my legs crossed. But yeah, it's an interesting time. So Deep, the company, if you're not familiar with Deep or Deep Engineering, They're about to put down, hopefully in the next week or so, the Vanguard habitat. So it will be the next iteration of, undersea life for humans. So interesting stuff going on. Next slide. From a NAUI perspective or from a scuba perspective, I am a technical advisor and technical examiner. A technical advisor is just a NAUI tech. So, as a technical examiner, I am a instructor of instructors, basically a technical instructor trainer for open and closed circuit down to 100 meters of what we call Trimix 2. I personally dive deeper than that, but that is where the NAUI training regime stops, at 100 meters. Um, and then some other, components. Formerly, I was the NAUI territory rep for Hawaii when I lived in Hawaii. And then occupationally, we talked about Georgia Aquarium. I was there for 4 years as the assistant diving safety officer, the dive officer at the University of Hawaii for 6 years when I was also the NAUI territory rep. And then 10 years at the California Academy of Sciences as the director, or correction, the senior manager of dive operations and diving safety officer. I love this picture on that's right here. This was actually a month ago, a little less than a month ago. These two folks, the brother is Richard Coleman. He's an ichthyologist at the University of Miami, and that's his graduate student, Juan Gonzalez. But our conversations during this class in Roatan a couple weeks ago frequently revolve around the fact that this picture is exceptionally rare in technical diving, right? You got two black dudes and this Latino dude, and that's the team. They're like no white people there. So that's and it's just not something that we see. That representation is not common. So, but yeah, I love it. All right. Next slide. I'm also a diver medical technician. I'm a former paramedic, but my DMT does stay current. So diver medical technicians are really offshore, basically offshore medics for diving injuries and stuff. So on the left side is actually me renewing my DMT certification at Deep last November and just running chambers. And on the right side is the Hyperlight that we used to have at the Academy. The Hyperlight 1 is a monoplace chamber, a recompression chamber, so portable solution where we can transfer TUP, transfer under pressure. So that's doing some drills in the dive locker there. And I think that's it for the background stuff. Oh, there's one more. Next slide. And I just threw this in here because this is probably the most fun dive, arguably the most fun dive I've ever done. And I didn't put the caption lava dive or anything in there, but it's that's the active lava flow in Kilauea. So diving in Hawaii, and it's the most visceral experience I've ever had in my life, times 10. I mean, being underwater when lava is hitting the water and contracting and exploding and so on. And the noise feels like an absolute war zone. I've never been in war, but yeah, it's only that dive was only 10 feet deep, and this is arguably the most fun I've ever had underwater. Probably the most nervous I've ever been as well. But it took a long time to get this close. Long time. Water was warm. It was hot. I can tell you more about it later. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. So I found that slide and I threw it in there just for fun. Okay, to the topic. Next slide. All right, checklist. So if we look up Merriam-Webster, you're going to see in Cambridge, the Cambridge Dictionary, you'll see various definitions, a list of things to be checked off or done. That's probably something we could all come up with. A list of things that you need to think about or you need to remember and stuff. And this is frequently why we use a checklist, because our memories are fallible, right? So we go to the store and we forget to do something, or we forget to pick up something. So we learn to make a checklist, or a list of things. Wikipedia gets a little more specific, which is probably a more functional definition for our use. And it says a checklist is a type of job, aid used in repetitive tasks to reduce failure by compensating for potential limits of human memory and attention. And human memory and attention we'll talk about a little bit more, or you'll hear that those two terms come up as we go through this, because the human memory is exceptionally limited. Contrary to popular belief, we can only hold about 5 to 8 things in our active memory at a time. And our minds are always dropping items to pick up new items and dropping items to pick up new items. And of course, this is why we forget things. And forgetting things from day to day isn't necessarily critical, but when we start getting into safety critical systems, as the next bullet point talks about, or into a high risk environment to include scuba, then forgetting things can be problematic. It's not always. Hopefully, we have systems and layers of protection that prevent any one thing being forgotten being catastrophic. So we have the ability to recover the event. But this is, why we use checklists. So, and then that last bullet point says checklists are used both to ensure that safety critical system preparations are carried out completely and in the correct order, and so on. So, all right, I'll go into the next slide. We'll talk more about memory and attention as it in coming up here. So a little note on, human factors. So everyone as an active scuba diver probably spends time on Facebook and hopefully is familiar with the Human Diver, a company founded by Gareth Locke. Gareth Locke was spent about 25 years in the Royal Air Force, got out, came into recreational diving, was already a recreational diver, but got really, really involved in it. And one of the things that he noticed is an absence of human factors and non-technical skills in the diving space, and particularly in comparison to aviation. And people will frequently say, well, aviation's a more professional space, but not necessarily, because we're talking about like recreational aviation, sport flying and stuff. So he created the Human Diver and really has endeavored to bring more of this information to light. And in light of the Maldives, accident that just happened with 5 people dying in the cave, probably seen tons of stuff on Facebook about it, and in the media and stuff. So if you weren't familiar with the Human Diver before or human factors, inevitably it probably comes up in some of the posts now more than ever. But human factors is a very large domain, and heavily psychology based, but it looks at not just psychology, but it looks at basically human interaction with a system. So that's human to human interaction, that's human to machine interaction. Ergonomics is a division of human factors, machine interfacing and so on. So, and then within that, we also have this other division called non-technical skills, which most people call soft skills. So one of the things going into checklists, and when we talk about human factors, is this whole idea, Daniel Kahneman's, he wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and some people might be familiar with it, but he basically talks about how decisions are made and talks about human thought. And there's this idea of system one being our fast decision-making system and system two being our slow decision-making system. And long story short, checklists, one of the things that checklists cause us to do is slow down, move from system one to system two. System one is mental shortcuts, heuristics. It's heavily based on cognitive bias, which is not necessarily a bad thing. In some respects, cognitive biases keep us safe. We're not talking about regarding not just people and interactions. We're talking about safety and environment and everything. It's our lived experiences and the things that we have learned as humans to engage with and things we have learned as humans to avoid. And 90, probably 5+% of everything we do every day falls into system one. We know not to, a bias we have is a stove being hot or any presence of heat, we're going to move away from it. We know not to touch it, right? But there are times when those mental shortcuts, those heuristics, those biases, these mental models that we have don't necessarily serve us in quick order. And that is when we're operating in safety critical spaces. That's when we need to operate with precision. We need to ensure that what we're doing is correct. And that's where we need to, or we're operating in novel environments or environments we're not exceptionally well practiced in or don't have a lot of experience with. This is when we have to slow down and think more about what we're doing. And that's essentially what checklists do, even for the well practice. Now, there is a misconception about checklists, and as with other memory aids, sometimes people think, well, checklists are for the amateur, or checklists are for, if I'm using a checklist, that means that I don't know what I'm doing, or that means that I can't remember something. Well, the reality is it does mean that you can't remember something. The checklist was created, it means that we can't remember. The checklist was created because we know our memory is fallible. We can only hold so much in our memory at a time. And when what we're doing is important, we need to ensure that we do it. Hence, we create a checklist. The idea of checklists being for amateurs or for the unskilled, the reality is checklists, when appropriately designed, are usually short and brief. And there's a whole like science into creating checklists or creating checklists that are usable. And aviation leads that way, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But checklists require that the user is educated in the process. So I think the presentation just popped off and back. Okay, we're catching up. So yeah, it does require that. It does require education. So checklists are for experts, not for novices. Um, there's too much to remember, hence we use a checklist to ensure that we catch everything. Now, there's this thing called ETO, the efficiency thoroughness trade-off. And I put down here the perception that recreational diving isn't as risky as, whoops, I'm just going that as occupational diving and so on. So um, the diving, I always tell people diving is diving. In other words, there's not much of a difference. If we're talking about a given dive mode, and when we say dive mode, I'm using the OSHA terminology, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. If you look up commercial diving, it has things called dive modes. And scuba is a dive mode, rebreather is a dive mode, which doesn't always make a lot of sense because a rebreather is scuba, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Is either open circuit or closed circuit. But our federal government tends to separate and say that open circuit scuba, that's what they call scuba, and a rebreather is a rebreather. And then, of course, the other common dive mode, particularly for commercial diving, the most common dive mode is surf supply diving. I would argue that as long as you're operating within the same dive mode, so let's say a commercial diver diving scuba or a recreational diver diving scuba, or we can move away from commercial and we can say a science diver diving scuba, something that we're even more familiar with. I would say that a lot of the risks are consistent. So all divers start out as recreational divers. Even if you go to commercial dive school, the very first thing you do in commercial dive school is you become a scuba diver. They give you a scuba diver open water certification, then they give you an advanced certification. And then from there, at least that's the way DIT and a lot of schools work, Diver Institute of Technology. And then from there, you move on to, you start learning surf supply diving because that's the way most of the working will be done. But everyone starts as a scuba diver. Everyone starts as a recreational scuba diver. Every science diver starts as a recreational scuba diver. So despite what folks in these different industries might say about, hey, I'm a professional and this is recreational, it's all the same. And when I say it's all the same in that from a risk perspective and what a diver has to do, it's all scuba divers have to monitor their depth. All scuba divers monitor their pressure. All scuba divers monitor their time, and they're responsible for that. All scuba divers have to monitor their team because they're diving with a team. Hopefully, we're diving as a team. And all scuba divers have to also monitor their environment and specifically the way home, the direction back to the mooring line, back to the anchor line, back to the beach to be able to, to surface and exit the water. Those five things are ubiquitous in any diving, whether you're a commercial scuba diver, whether you're a recreational scuba diver, whether you're a scientific scuba diver. The only thing that changes once we start diving occupationally, commercial or scientific, is that there's an added task that also might be there when we dive recreationally. The idea that you still have to do these five things, but you also have to get this task completed, whether it's a survey, or whether it's a photogrammetry plot or something. But the reality is recreational divers frequently also use GoPros or video rigs and take video. They also engage in photography and they make observations sometimes, particularly if they're involved in citizen science and so on. So there's not a huge difference. It's all diving, and that's the reality. So when we talk about efficiency, thoroughness, trade-off, just kind of wrapping that piece up, um, frequently people you want to, as humans, we want to get things done. This gets back into that thinking fast and slow, right? We just want to get to the thing and get the thing done. And as humans, we're hardwired for efficiency. And that's a term that, like, I feel like if there's one thing you take from this presentation, it's the fact that humans are hardwired for efficiency and you don't have the ability to turn that off. That's always in the back running. It's always the processor's always running. Humans are always trying to get the most done with the least amount of effort. And when I say effort, people say things like, "Oh, it sounds like you're calling somebody lazy." No, and laziness is something I always debunk as well, and that more comes from Gareth Locke and others in the human factor space. Laziness or complacency, and those terms like laziness and complacency versus efficiency. And in the human factor space, we say the difference between complacency and efficiency is outcome. If someone is efficient and has a good outcome, you're rewarded. If you are efficient and have a bad outcome, you're complacent. Oh, you weren't doing what you're supposed to do. It's all about outcome. There's a huge outcome bias that humans have when it comes to that term, complacency or laziness and so on. We're hardwired for efficiency. We're always trying to get things done. And that comes right back to checklists. It's getting us to slow down, move out of that system one thinking, that system two thinking, and actively think about what we're doing when there's greater risk involved or when actions are not reversible, you know. So that's the idea there. But it takes time, and that's the trade-off. The thoroughness is about professionalism. So there is a balance between things. At some point, we throw so many checklists at a task, and there's no task getting done because we're spending hours going through checklists. So there is definitely a balance that has to be there. Okay, attention, memory and attention. So in diving frequently, I'll definitely say recreational diving, we don't see as many checklists. What we see a lot of would be mnemonics. In now we have like for pre-dive briefing, we have CBAG. For PADI, I forget, it's some acronym with friends. Friends don't let friends, or I can't remember exactly. I'm not a PADI instructor, so my apologies there. GUE has GUE Edge. I should say I'm also a UTD, a Unified Team Diving instructor. UTD, we have GLAD. We used to have something called SAD, but these acronyms are nice. They're memory aids, but the problem is frequently with some of these letters, there are multiple things associated with it. And that can make it difficult for people to decipher and remember all the different things in CBAG that are associated with the word buoyancy, or they're associated the S for sight, multiple things. Someone put BWARF, yeah, so yeah, that's it. So having things written down frequently helps. The other thing is humans we're fallible, right? And we're easily distracted. So when we're in the process of doing something and someone calls our name or diverts our attention, and every instructor, dive master definitely knows this. All humans understand this, but definitely from a diving perspective, if you're a diving leader, you know this. There's something that you meant to do, like maybe set up your kit and get your equipment ready, and then another diver asks you a question or says, "Hey, I'm having a problem here," or you notice someone is struggling with something. So you now get distracted and start focusing on them. You get them ready, and then you forget to do what you're going to do. And then you realize, as you're kidding up that, oh, you forgot to turn on your air or you forgot to do a check and something like that. So, and hopefully it's caught because we have checks. But if it's written down, then we tend to come back to it most of the time. I'll go to the next slide. Oh, here we go. So checklist genesis. So if the modern thinking of checklists. So first of all, I should say if you went into the dictionary or get online and search checklist, I found this interesting. I think the first usage of the word checklist it dates back to maybe 1800s, sometime in the 1800s. But if we think about our modern thinking about checklists and the way it's used, it really comes back to the B-17 Flying Fortress and an accident that happened in 1935 that killed a couple of crew members. Some of the observers in the back survived, but the pilot and the co-pilot died. Um, and this accident was the air crew took off and they forgot to remove the control lock, or another word is gust lock. So, an aircraft has control surfaces that allow you to, ailerons on the wings that allow the airplane to roll, and an elevator on the tail on the small wing in the back, the horizontal stabilizer that allows the plane to pitch up and down, allows the pilot to manipulate it, right? And when this aircraft sits on the ground and strong winds come by and stuff, because those control surfaces are airfoils, they produce lift and they have surface area, they can get pushed around. And as they get pushed around, the control column moves, back and forth, and that banging can cause damage to the control cables, to the control column and the control surfaces. So as a result, you put a pin or some type of locking mechanism to keep everything fixed so it's not banging around. That's what a control lock is, or a gust lock for folks that don't fly. Now, of course, from that explanation, you would understand then that as a pilot taking off and your controls are locked, this is going to be problematic, as it was for this air crew. Airplane was probably trimmed in just the right position that when they got ready to take off, they couldn't manipulate the controls and the airplane reached speed and still took off, end up stalling and crashing at low level. So from that, Boeing said, oh, we need a checklist. And this is where checklists were created. Up to 1935, going back to 1903, the Wright brothers, the first aircraft, there's really no documentation that I'm aware of an aircraft having a checklist. Pilots were taught just this is what you do. Remember to do these things and stuff. But the B-17 marked or ushered in an era of complexity of aircraft that it went beyond the ability for pilot and air crews just to commit the stuff to memory. There needed to be checks. And the checks weren't just flying aircraft. It was everything from, going to the current iteration of pre-flight all the way to, securing aircraft post-flight and every other phase of flight in between. So checklists moving past aviation are ubiquitous in high risk industries. They're ubiquitous in nuclear power. Nowadays, medicine. There's been a collective push to have checklists more, checklists in medicine, surgical checklists and stuff. And there's definitely papers and so on that have been written about the reduction of patients being harmed, surgical sponges and other, apparatus and stuff being left in patients and so on. These things are all accounted for with checklists nowadays, and it's increased patient safety. Um, and of course, diving. So from a diving perspective, military, commercial, and I would say to a decent degree, scientific divers use checklists. It's definitely codified across commercial and military. I'll go to the next slide. Okay, so now let's get into checklist used in diving. This particular checklist we'll talk about again. Next slide. So training is probably the first place that most people know that checklists are used, like from a diving perspective, and used very commonly. Like it's probably, I would argue it's probably uncommon nowadays to find an instructor engaging in a training program without any paperwork or documentation. And I mean laminated or slate or something that they have with them underwater, whether they have it with them underwater, whether they have it topside or whatever. But, training checklists, training has evolved to a place where if for no other reason than liability, instructors need a list, and it's usually prescribed by the agencies that there's a list of skills that have to go that the instructor has to go through, and it needs to be checked off, and some attestation needs to be done for liability purposes. So most people are familiar with, yeah, of course, my instructor has a checklist and so on, and make sure that I've done all these skills and perform them to a particular level. Next, and that's just, same thing. So a checklist for training, and then depending on the training, the checklist just gets kind of beefier and beefier and larger, right? So this is rebreather training. Next slide. And your open water checklist, might, has X number of skills, and this is an example of a CCR, closed circuit rebreather diver evaluation checklist that I created, that I use at the academy. Next slide. Okay. From a safety perspective, so the things that we're going to talk about now are things that I would encourage people to think about. And let me say, I'll say a couple things. First of all, time-wise, I'm going to run through this because we had some technical stuff going on and so on. So I'm going to get through it, and hopefully there's some time for questions. But anything that anybody wants, you can always email me. I don't think my email is on the slide, but I'll make sure that everyone has, or put it in the chat and so on. So, I'm a big advocate of divers having a clipboard. Now, that clipboard can be a physical clipboard. It can be your phone. You can put these things in your phone. Most people are taking their phones on boats nowadays, putting them in a dry bag or a case or so on, something so that you have it. It does not necessarily, whether it's something that you are physically checking off or something you're just using and going through with your finger to ensure these things are done. Everything I'm going to talk about will not be applicable to everyone's diving, or at least not to the same degree. A lot of the checklists and the things that we're going to go through are items I used at the academy to manage a relatively complex dive scheme, with dives that were, as you all heard, down to 500 feet, for a coral reef investigation and research and study, and fish. So all these things won't be directly applicable. But that said, even to some degree, all this stuff is. And this one is at the Academy, our daily dive team equipment checklist. And this particular checklist was to be done by a dive officer before, or it could be any diver before boarding the boat, or at least before the boat, cast off from the dock. Or if we were shore diving, it was done before divers hit the water. So there are certain things that will be applicable for all dive teams, and definitely for dive leaders. But I frequently try to educate divers and get them to move out of the space of just trusting dive team or dive leaders. Dive leaders meaning instructors are instructors, and you obviously hopefully do have trust in your instructor. But a dive master in a random location, these things may or may not be done. I can tell you my personal experience. It's not uncommon that when I question folks about some of this stuff, I get interesting responses, and I'll be nice and I'll say it like that. So the O2 kit, there should be an O2 kit. As we all know, it should be on site. We should check the pressure. The pressure, ideally, for me, I check daily, or at least ask about the pressure daily. And then the other thing is, does it have everything that it needs as far as delivery devices? It's not uncommon that I can tell you in many places I've been, there is a nice cylinder with a regulator, and there is pressure, no matter how hard it is to open that cylinder, because who knows when the last time that thing had any service done. But that said, it does have pressure. And then I look at delivery devices, and the non-rebreather looks like it was probably manufactured in 1985. It's totally deteriorated. There's no bag valve mask resuscitator, or there's no oral nasal resuscitation mask. So if the diver was not breathing, we would have no way to actually administer oxygen to this diver while, performing rescue breathing or CPR and so on. So those are the things that I'm talking about. It's also not uncommon to go and get on a dive boat and there be no AED, or the dive operator has no AED, which I'm always a little perplexed about. And then first aid kit. You look at a first aid kit and, it's items that are open, expired, deteriorated, and so on. I'm not saying all dive operators are like this. Definitely not. There are plenty of high quality dive operators, but there are also a fair number of folks that, due to economics and time and so on, these things definitely slip through the cracks. So as divers, we want to be responsible and take care of ourselves and take care of our team. So some type of checklist for you to remember to check these things or to pack these things is important. So it could be much shorter than what is here. Next slide. Equipment setup. So the what you're seeing here, when I say equipment setup, we're talking about inspecting items. We're talking about going through the setup and then doing function checks. What you're seeing here is a rebreather checklist. So it's a bit beefier. It goes without saying than an open circuit if you're just diving a single tank regulator, BC cylinder setup. That doesn't mean that there aren't checks that should be done, as we all know on our open circuit scuba systems there are, but there are more checks done on a rebreather because there's just more to it. It's a more complex, underwater breathing apparatus and so on. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, there we go. There's probably a delay in there. I see. So this is one of our divers going through that same diver with the checklist going through and doing the various checks on the system. Now, a rebreathe is more complicated, but that doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of checks that, as we know, that should be done on a scuba set. What I teach for a scuba set, there are a bunch of checks, and I can't say that all these checks are necessarily easily committed to memory. They are through multiple days of instruction, but that's my experience when, as a dive officer across 3 different dive programs, we have certified divers coming in, and then we do our equipment setup process. And the divers frequently respond that, oh, this is, yeah, I was not taught to do this, or I have not done this. So I'm not showing you that particular slide, but we write down the scuba equipment setup as a way for divers to read through and understand when they get oriented, and then to our program, and then that setup sheet is also laminated and put in the clipboard. So something as simple as attaching BCs and circumferentially pulling up on both of one or two of the BC straps, however many straps that it has, to ensure that the cylinder is secure. Cracking valves before you attach first stages to ensure that you're not blowing water into them. Checking, pulling negative pressure checks on both second stages before turning on the air to ensure that you can't pull air. If you can pull air, you will pull water. Checking that the SPG reads 0 before you turn it on. If it doesn't read 0, then at least if the SPG sits at 500, the needle sits at 500 psi before you turn it on, and you turn it on, it goes to 3,500. You realize that 500 is the 0 point. Yes, you should change the gauge, but at least for that particular dive, you don't have 3,500 psi. You only have 3,000 psi. So checking the needle before turning it on is critical. Turning it on slowly and watching the smooth needle deflation or a smooth needle movement is important. Frequently, we teach divers to put the SPG away from them, and we actually should tell them to look at it from an angle to check for corrosion and make sure that there's smooth, that the bourdon tube, the mechanism, and the needle have smooth motion. So you don't have like some stick. SPG goes to 1,000 and then jumps to 3,000. There's no accuracy between 1,000 and 3,000. The only way you would know that is to look at when you set it up. Breathing off both second stages, inhale and exhale, and looking for fluctuations in the needle. That's a subjective breathing test. And then lastly, orally inflating the BC and then power inflating until the overpressure relief activates and letting it sit for a minute. So all of that for us is a setup of a scuba system. But I just said a lot of things, and that is something that could be easily forgotten, but any one of those things could be critical. And if we went through accident and incident statistics, I can take any one of those and find more than one incident or accident that relates to one of those 6 things I just named. Next slide. Equipment setup. So from the in the rebreather world, we all, well, I can't say the rebreather world because I don't know what the entire rebreather world does. I will say in our world, there's some mutual accountability as far as rebreather setup. So what you're seeing here are two of our divers, and they're presenting their checklist to each other. So in our world, to include an instructor or a dive officer like myself, when I teach classes, my students always check me. So there's mutual accountability to ensure that divers have done what they need to do, and also looking at the applicable numbers, which I'm not going to get into right now, to ensure that they are within the ranges